Good morning, or whatever time it is, wherever you're at right now when you're watching this. If you haven't seen my most recent episode, though, on Karn Silex, make sure you check that episode out when you get a chance. But before you go do that, make sure you stay tuned to this episode because, well, we have something very unexpected during this spoiler season. Because yesterday on Wizards' website, there might have been a little bit of a boo-boo. A little mistake, a tiny eensy little mistake, because if you see this recreated image, apparently there was just this little picture on the Commander Decks tab, which is no longer there, but it was there, and this is the internet, so someone was able to grab that image file, and of course it is large enough for us to see exactly what this card does. So yeah, just a little bit of a boo-boo during Dominaria United spoiler season. We are getting a spoiler as well, an unexpected one at that, from the Warhammer 40k, or 40,000, or however you say that. I know there's fans out there of Warhammer that keep saying, "You saying it wrong!" I'm sorry, I don't play it. Anyways, the Swarmlord is here, and of course a big thank you to mtg.design, where I made the custom card version of this, but yeah, just basically took all the details from the card that we clearly saw, and then also Wizards did share the actual image of the Swarmlord, the actual art, so we have that too. And yeah, this is essentially confirmed to be an actual spoiler because this was on, Wizards' actual website. Regardless, the Swarmlord is a 5/5 Tyrannoid. Let's go with that again. Warhammer 40k people, please be gentle in the comments below. I'm trying my best. That costs 3 green, blue, red. It has rapid regeneration. The Swarmlord enters the battlefield with 2+1 counters on it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. And on top of that, Xenos Cunning. Whenever a creature you control with a counter on it dies, draw a card. So this commander obviously can get massive throughout the game if you have to keep casting it. Now, it does have a pretty high converted mana cost already at 6. And of course, if it keeps getting dealt with, well, it's going to keep costing more and more. Yes, you are in green. That can still be pretty mana intensive though throughout the game. Still, again, the threat level of this commander can keep increasing. That being said, the more important part, and the part that I feel like more players are going to build around, is that second part. Whenever a creature control with a counter on it dies, draw a card. Now, keep in mind, yes, that obviously counts ++1 counters, but it also counts, any kind of a counter. It does not matter what kind of a counter it is. As long as one of your creatures had a counter on it and it dies, you draw a card. Also, keep in mind, Wizards lately has been kind of adding more and more restrictions to cards, it does seem. But here it doesn't seem like Wizards added really any restrictions to this. It doesn't specify non-token creatures, which is huge. It doesn't say, this triggers only once each turn or only during your turn. So yeah, there is a lack of restriction here, which is great for value. Yeah, you can draw an absurd amount of cards with this commander in play. Which I guess isn't surprising. Teamers just Simic with red added in, right? Regardless, okay, again, disclaimer. This card has not been officially confirmed, but basically it was since it showed up on Wizards' actual website with an image of it. So, I highly doubt there's anything that is going to be different about this when we actually see, the actual version officially spoiled by Wizards. But still, I just want to make sure I put out that disclaimer. And then in the description below, I also want to mention that there, of course, is a link to the list of cards I'm talking about on this episode. So, yeah, if you are excited about this commander, though it isn't coming out for, a little while. I can't remember. There's so many products. I think it's in October when the Warhammer 40k Commander decks come out. Regardless, if you are excited about this commander, you might want to consider picking up some cards sooner rather than later, because when a new commander is spoiled, sometimes the prices of cards that work well with it go up sooner rather than later. And now with all that said, let's jump into those cards. First up, yeah, obviously ++1 counters will work very well with this commander. I mean, and there's a ton of fantastic ++1 counter creatures and synergies in these colors. I mean, let's just start talking about Bane of Progress, Forgotten Ancient, and Chasm Skulker, to name a few. Bane of Progress has a massive ETB. When enters the battlefield, destroy all artifacts and enchantments, put a +1 counter on Bane of Progress for each permanent destroyed this way. So this can be a huge board wipe and also a heavy hitter. That also, I mean, obviously, it's going to probably get at least one counter on it when it comes into play. So obviously, when it dies, you're going to be able to replace it with a card thanks to your commander. And then Forgotten Ancient can also get massive very quickly in a game of Commander. Whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and not more importantly, but very important as well, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. So not only can this get a ton of counters on it, but it can also disperse those counters, which is huge for this commander because, again, the more and more creatures that you have with counters on them, the more potential card draw you have. And speaking of which, there's Chasm Skulker, which says whenever you draw a card, put a +1 counter on Chasm Skulker. So yeah, essentially, if you've got creatures dying that have counters on them, this just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when this dies, you get X11 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk Rex the number of counters on Chasm Skulker. And of course, if you've got, something like Forgotten Ancient out there, you can get more counters on those creatures to, lead to even more card draw. And obviously, I'll bring up some other ways to get a lot of counters on your things. Yeah, I mean, this commander has a lot of potential to draw an absurd amount of cards and provide you a ton of value. In a somewhat similar way, though, there's Nadir Kraken, a 2/3 that has, when you draw a card, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1 counter on Nadir Kraken and create a 1/1 blue tentacle creature token. So, unlike Chasm Skulker, you do have to pay for this, but you are getting those creature tokens right away. Still, this can be a very effective card in a deck like this. And when it comes to creature tokens and counters, of course we've got to bring up Avenger of Zendikar. When it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 plant creature token for each land you control. Yeah, you're in green, you're going to have a ton of lands, and a landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1 counter on each plant creature you control. So obviously, it's quite easy just to get even just one counter on all your plants, and yeah, that does a lot of card draw potential with this commander. Speaking of which, there's Dragon Broodmother, which is incredible with the Swarmlord. It says at the beginning of each upkeep, put a 1/1 red and green dragon creature token with flying and Devour 2 into play. And Devour 2 means that as the token comes into play, you can sacrifice a number of creatures. It comes into play with twice that many +1 counters on it. So this is actually quite simple in how you can literally just draw a card essentially every single turn with this, and yes, that counts your opponent's turns as well. You get a dragon into play, you sacrifice a creature with a counter on it, cool, that dragon gets 2 counters on it. Then the next upkeep happens, and you get another dragon into play with Devour 2, you sacrifice even just that dragon that has counters on it. Cool, this one gets 2 counters on it then. So you basically just keep sacrificing, even just these dragons that keep getting counters on them to each other, and the Swarmlord keeps triggering every single turn, and this is just basically, again, hey, draw a card on every player's turn, which is pretty crazy. Now, like I mentioned before, of course, I mentioned there are plenty of ways to ensure that your creatures are getting counters on them no matter what they are, essentially. Oh, okay, with Grumgully, there is a slight requirement. Each other non-human creature you control enters the battlefield with additional +1 counter on it. Now, a lot of creatures, in fact, the vast majority, if not, I believe, all the creatures I've already mentioned so far are not human. So, yeah, basically, a lot of creatures can come and play with additional counter on them. And then Renata has no such requirement. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with additional +1 counter on it. And then Master Biomancer takes a step further. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power. And as a mutant addition to other types, the mutant part really doesn't matter all that much, but yeah. An additional 2 counters at the very least is great. And of course, if you get more and more counters on Master Biomancer to make it more massive, you are getting every single one of your creatures much more massive when they come into play. And of course, most importantly, you are meeting the requirement, again, with basically any of these, for getting a counter on essentially all of your creatures, so that basically, again, when they die, you are getting card advantage. And actually, there's some enchantments that can help us out as well. Hardened Scales is, of course, a great one in any kind of decks that want to lean into +1/+1 counters. If one or more +1 counters are put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So this is just a fantastic value for just a 1 mana enchantment, and yeah, this can make our creatures much more deadly throughout the game. And speaking of deadly, there's Rhythm of the Wild. It says creature spells you control can't be countered, so that's huge. And of course, on top of that, non-token creatures you control have Riot. So, and again, Riot is they enter the battlefield with a choice of a +1 counter on it or haste. So basically now, yeah, you can essentially guarantee that all of your non-token creatures are going to be getting a counter on them if they need it, and if they need that haste, go swing away with them. In a somewhat similar way, there's Invigorating Hot Spring, which says, enters the battlefield with 4 +1 counters on it, modified creatures you control have haste, remove a +1 counter from it, put a +1 counter on target creature you control, activate only as a sorcery and only once each turn. So first up, this is a great way to distribute a couple of counters, and then again, modified creatures you control have haste. Modified creatures are ones that, either equipped, have auras, or, counters on them. So yeah, that's a very easy requirement for this deck to meet for basically all of our creatures. So basically our creatures have haste, which of course can be a very deadly thing, of course, especially with, a commander that can become as potentially pretty massive. Speaking of which, there's other benefits that we can get from our creatures having counters on them. I mean, let's just talk about cards like Tuskguard Captain, Herald of Secret Streams, and Rishkar Pima Renegade. Tuskguard Captain says, each creature you control with a +1 counter on it has trample. So this is just a great way to make our army even deadlier, and yeah, a great way especially for our commander to get some damage through. Speaking of which, Herald of Secret Streams is incredible with a deck like this. Creatures you control with +1 counter on them can't be blocked. Essentially having an unblockable army, yeah, who doesn't want that? Next up, there's Rishkar Pima Renegade, a 2/2 that has when it enters the battlefield, put a +1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures, so this can distribute some counters, which is fantastic. And on top of that, each creature you control a counter on it has tap, add green. Now, keep in mind again, that does not specify +1 counter, so any counter will do. But yeah, now being able to have essentially our entire army tap for mana and basically be mana dorks, this can have things get pretty out of control pretty quickly. Speaking of out of control, let's talk about Persist now, and I'm just going to give one example of this with Glen Elenda Archmage, which is a fantastic Persist creature. It has pay a blue, sacrifice it, counter target non-creature spell, which is incredible, and of course Persist, so when this creature dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return to the battlefield under its control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So this can be obviously a great way to counter a non-creature spell very effectively, and multiple times again, essentially because of that Persist. And of course, with that -1/-1 counter on it, when it dies the next time, we draw a card. But the potential for a Persist creature like this one is even greater in a deck like this. Because again, keep in mind, we've got things like, Grumgully and Renata, which essentially are like, hey, you get a +1/+1 counter just for coming into play. And of course, with that happening, well, that +1/+1 counter is going to negate the -1/-1 counter, and they both basically just go away. So now it doesn't have a -1/-1 counter on it anymore, and we can just keep persisting this essentially infinitely. Or at least I should say if we're set up, with a free sacrifice outlet or whatnot, but we'll talk about those here in a bit. Regardless, yeah, Persist creatures can be very effective with this commander. And of course, we can give all of our creatures Persist with an incredible card in this deck with Cauldron of Souls. It has tap, choose any number of target creatures, each of those creatures gains Persist until end of turn. This is a great way to get additional value out of our creatures, and again, to set them up essentially at the very least to draw an extra card when they die again. But also again, in combination with, again, like something like Renata, our creatures come into play also with a +1 counter on them, so that negates the -1/-1 counter, and our creatures are, well, pretty hard to kill at that point. Of course, there are other creatures as well that deal with -1/-1 counters, though. I mean, let's talk about Devoted Druid. Tap for a green, put a -1/-1 counter on it, untap Devoted Druid. So this can just be a great low-to-the-ground mana dork that can help us out early, and then also, if we actually need to draw that card at some point, we can just put those -1/-1 counters on it whenever we need to. Of course, there are other kinds of counters as well, though. I mean, like we see with keyword counters on things like Titanolf Rex and Slippery Bog Bonder. Titanolf Rex is an 11/11 with trample, but we can also just cycle it away for 1 and a green, and when we do, we put a trample counter on target creature we control. And then Slippery Bog Bonder is a 3/3 flash and hexproof, and when it enters the battlefield, we put a hexproof counter on target creature, then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. So this can actually be a really good way to protect our commander in certain situations, and also potentially a way to turn into a one-shot KO. I mean, we're going to have a lot of counters out there. Putting them all on our commander can be, a really big splashy play if we want to go in that direction. Another kind of counter, though, to consider are going to be level up counters, which we see on cards like Enclave Cryptologist and Kazandu Tuskcaller. Enclave Cryptologist starts off as just a 0/1, but if we level it up between levels 1 and 2 by paying 1 and a blue at sorcery speed, we can tap it to draw a card, then discard a card, or looting essentially, and if we get to level 3 or above, we get to draw a card when we tap it. And then Kazandu Tuskcaller has level up for 1 and a green, it's 2 to 5, is tap, create a 3/3 green elfin creature token, and it's level 6 plus is create 2 of those tokens instead. So yeah, each of these can be very helpful, and again, they are low to the ground creatures that we can level up quite easily, and, you know, again, when they die then, because they've got those level up counters on them, we get to draw a card. So yeah, just make sure you are considering, you know, counters outside of just +1/+1 counters. Again, we got -1/-1 counters, keyword counters, level up counters. I'm sure I'm forgetting other kinds of counters, but yeah, make sure you're considering counters outside of just those +1/+1 counters for this kind of a build. Or should I say, depending on what kind of a build you want. Also, when it comes to counters, yeah, obviously also consider, you know, proliferate effects like we see on Evolution Sage. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, proliferate, and again, yeah, you're in green, so you got plenty of ways to get a ton of lands into play to get that trigger a lot. Proliferating means that you choose any number of permanents and/or players and give each another kind of counter already there. So yeah, I mean, depending on what those counters are, I mean, obviously with -1/-1 counters, you might not want to put extra ones on your creatures, but yeah, +1/+1 counters most definitely, so that you can just, you know, make your creatures even deadlier. Of course, we also have some other kinds of cards to consider, though, like Teferi's Ageless Insight and Thought Reflection, both of which can be incredible in this kind of a deck once we get things going. Teferi's Ageless Insight says, if you would draw a card except the first when you draw on each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead, and Thought Reflection is very similar. It basically does the exact same thing, but it says if you draw a card, draw 2 cards instead, so, you know, no requirement of it not being your first card. Doubling up our card draw is incredible, especially with a commander like this one that can draw us a ton of cards throughout the game, essentially getting twice the amount of value just for having one of these enchantments in play is great. And speaking of great enchantments, like I mentioned earlier, yeah, free sacrifice outlets like, you know, Greater Good or Goblin Bombardment can be fantastic as well. Greater Good says sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrifice creature's power, then discard 3 cards. This can help us dig through our deck very quickly again, especially with all those +1/+1 counters that we have, you know, that we're going to be able to put on creatures. We can have some massive creatures in play that we can then sacrifice to not only draw a card from our commander's trigger, but also to draw a lot of cards from this. But yeah, even a sacrifice out like Goblin Bombardment that doesn't inherently provide us any card advantage is great with this commander because again, I mean, it says sacrifice a creature, it deals 1 damage to any target, which is fantastic. But, you know, with our commander, it's basically like, okay, if you sacrifice any creature with a counter on it, draw a card. So essentially, sacrifice outlets like these can essentially ensure that we are drawing cards when we need them. And of course, again, in combination with, you know, a persist creature, and again, something like Renata or, you know, Grumgully that can get counters on them when they come into play, that's just basically infinite. So Gun Bombardment, yeah, just keep sacrificing your persist creature again and again and again to ping down all of your opponents and other things, and you win! So yeah, that's definitely a direction you can take the deck as well. But now as this episode is coming to a close, it's time for me to give you my final thoughts on the Swarmlord. Yeah, I did not expect to be doing a quick take on one of these Warhammer commanders anytime soon. But here we are, and I'm not sure why I'm talking like this, but it's early. Need some more coffee, clearly. Nevertheless, yes, this commander has a lot of potential. And again, quick disclaimer. Not officially spoiled, just a mistake on the Wizards website, but seems like a very, you know, valid mistake. So I guess only time will tell and we'll see, but yeah, basically, I mean, you can probably assume that this is real. So again, if you are excited about this commander and might want to pick up some cards sooner rather than later, that might work really well with it, make sure you check out that link in the description below. That's got the card list of all the cards I talked about on this episode. And of course, make sure you check out my other quick takes and spoilers, and make sure you're staying tuned for even more exciting quick takes and spoilers. Most likely not from Warhammer, most likely from, you know, Dominaria United, but we'll see. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.